You rebuilt yourself after the collapse, and the version you built was designed to never be hurt again. Not stronger, armored. There is a difference, and that difference is costing you everything. The weak do not know this distinction. They confuse walls with foundations. They confuse silence with stillness. They close off the fracture points and call it healing. What they have actually done is entombed the wound inside the architecture. The crack is still there. It is simply hidden beneath performance, beneath the curated version of self that gets presented to employers, to partners, to the mirror at 6 in the morning when the mask is hardest to maintain. This is not a personal failure. It is a pattern so common it has become invisible. The modern mind, after collapse, reaches for identity the way a drowning man reaches for driftwood. Anything that floats, a new routine, a new aesthetic. A new philosophy worn like clothing, and for a time it works. The driftwood holds. But driftwood is not a vessel. It was never built to carry you anywhere. The Stoics understood something that has been systematically removed from modern psychological culture. They understood that collapse is not the enemy of identity, it is the precondition for it. Marcus Aurelius did not write the Meditations from a position of comfort. He wrote them from the interior of a man who was simultaneously emperor and prisoner, prisoner to duty, to grief, to the weight of a civilization balanced on his decisions. He did not process his fractures publicly. He did not perform his reconstruction. He wrote to himself in private in the dark because he knew that the forge is not a place for an audience. The philosopher does not rebuild in the open. The sovereign does not display the blueprint of his own reconstruction. Iron does not become a blade by remaining comfortable. It becomes one only after the fire has destroyed everything it was before. This is not metaphor offered for comfort. This is the mechanical reality of transformation. The fire does not care about your history. It cares only about what you are made of. And here is where the ancient mirror becomes uncomfortable. Because the Stoic tradition does not ask what happened to you. It asks what you are choosing to become in response. That question, held honestly, is heavier than most people are willing to carry. It removes the architecture of victimhood, not cruelly but surgically. It leaves you standing in the rubble with nothing but raw material and the decision of what to forge. The paradox is this. The version of you that collapsed, that fractured under betrayal, under failure, under the weight of a life that did not hold its shape, that version was not your weakest self. It was your most honest one. The collapse did not reveal your inadequacy. It revealed what was never truly solid to begin with. And that revelation, as brutal as it felt, was the first honest thing your identity had experienced in years. Kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold, is not about hiding the fracture. It is about making the fracture the most structurally significant part of the object. The gold does not conceal the break, it consecrates it. The repaired vessel is not weaker at the point of fracture. It is, by the nature of the gold, harder there than anywhere else. This is what the disciplined know that the weak refuse to accept. The collapse was not the end of your identity. It was the demolition of the false architecture you had been living inside. The structure that fell was never yours. It was assembled from other people's expectations, from fear, from the accumulated compromises of a self that was always performing and never arriving. What remains after the fire is not nothing. What remains is the only material that was ever real. But here is where most people stop. they stand in the rubble. They feel the silence of it, and because nothing around them is familiar, they assume nothing is salvageable. They begin to build again, immediately, frantically, because silence feels like failure and emptiness feels like death. The warrior does not move in that moment. The warrior reads the rubble, because the rubble tells you exactly what the structure was made of. And if you leave before you have read it, if you build again before you have understood what collapsed and why, you will build the same architecture. Slightly different aesthetic, same foundation, same fracture lines. Same inevitable collapse arriving on a different schedule. This is part 1. Not the beginning of recovery, the beginning of honesty. The forge is not ahead of you, you are already inside it. The only question is whether you are paying attention to what the fire is showing you, or whether you are still trying to protect what is already ash. The rubble does not wait for you to be ready. It simply is. And what you do in the silence of that wreckage, before the rebuilding, before the performance of recovery, before the first stone is placed on another, determines everything that follows. There are 2 pillars that separate the man who rebuilds from the man who merely reassembles. They are not techniques, they are not habits you can schedule into a morning routine. They are orientations of the self, fundamental shifts in how you relate to your own fracture. The disciplined know them not because they were taught them, but because the fire made them unavoidable. The first pillar is this: suffering is not information unless you treat it as information. The weak experience pain as weather. It arrives, it overwhelms, it passes. They survive it the way a building survives a storm, by enduring, not by learning. The walls are still standing, so they call it strength. But the storm has shown them exactly where the mortar is weak. Exactly where the foundation shifts, exactly which walls were never load-bearing. And they have looked away from every single one of those revelations, because looking at them would require admitting that the architecture was wrong from the beginning. The philosopher does not look away. The philosopher sits in the damage and reads it the way a general reads a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. Not with grief, not with self-pity, with precision. Every fracture is a data point. Every point of collapse is a confession from the structure about what it was never capable of bearing. The sovereign who has walked through fire does not mourn the burning, he catalogues it. He asks which walls fell first and why. He asks what load he placed on beams that were never designed to hold it. He asks, without sentimentality, what he was asking his identity to carry that his identity was never built for. This is the first pillar. The conversion of suffering into structural intelligence, not healing, not acceptance. Intelligence, cold, architectural, precise. Consider 2 men, same collapse. A relationship that ended not gradually but catastrophically, betrayal. The kind that does not just end a chapter but retroactively rewrites every chapter before it. The same fracture, the same silence afterward. The weak man moves within 30 days. New apartment, new aesthetic, new wardrobe assembled from the identity of a man he has decided to become. He is in the gym, he is posting. He is performing reconstruction with the same energy he once performed the relationship. He has not read the rubble, he has paved over it. The new structure rises quickly because he is using the same materials, the same need for external validation. The same architecture of self built outward toward an audience rather than inward toward a core. It looks different, it is identical. The fracture lines are already there, waiting for the next weight. The sovereign does not move immediately. He sits in the silence of the empty space. He does not perform grief and he does not perform recovery. He reads, he asks what the relationship was asking him to be that he was not. He asks what compromises he made so slowly he stopped noticing them. He asks where he placed his sense of self inside another person's perception of him, and he locates the exact moment that transfer happened. Because that moment is the fracture point. Not the betrayal, the transfer. The betrayal was simply the fire that revealed it. One man builds again, one man forges. The difference is not visible from the outside. Not yet, but the blade and the driftwood look identical before the first real weight is placed on them. The second pillar is silence, not the silence of absence, the silence of refusal. The modern architecture of identity is built on disclosure. You are expected to process publicly, to narrate your reconstruction in real time, to offer your fractures as content. The culture has reframed exposure as courage and privacy as shame. This inversion is not accidental. A man who processes in public is a man who is building his identity from the outside in, assembling himself from the reactions he receives. Calibrating his reconstruction to the approval of an audience that did not earn the right to witness the forge. Marcus Aurelius did not post the meditations. He wrote them to himself in private because he understood that the forge is not a spectacle. The iron does not perform its transformation. It simply undergoes it in heat, in silence, until it is something that was not possible before the fire. Silence practiced with intention is not emptiness. It is pressure. It is the kiln that forces the gold into the fracture rather than allowing it to dissipate into performance. The disciplined man who refuses to narrate his collapse in real time is not suppressing it. He is concentrating it. He is turning the full weight of his attention inward, toward the architecture, toward the fracture lines, toward the question of what he is actually made of beneath the layers of performance that the collapse has stripped away. This is the second pillar, the discipline of internal construction. Building inward before you build outward, forging the core before you raise the walls. Knowing what you are made of before you ask anything to depend on it. The cost of ignoring these two pillars is not dramatic. It does not arrive as catastrophe, it arrives as repetition. The same collapse, different year. The same fracture, different relationship. The same walls falling at the same load-bearing points. Because the architecture was never examined and therefore never changed. The man who builds without reading the rubble does not fail spectacularly. He fails incrementally, across decades. In the quiet accumulation of a life that never quite holds its shape, a life that always feels slightly provisional. Slightly temporary. Slightly like a structure that is one bad season away from coming down again. That is not a warning, that is the mechanical outcome of skipping the forge. The fire is still burning, the rubble is still readable, the gold is still available. But gold does not fill a fracture you refuse to locate. Gold does not fill a fracture you refuse to locate. So here is what locating it actually looks like, not in theory. Not as philosophy worn like clothing, as protocol. As the three commands that separate the man who forges from the man who merely survives the fire and calls the survival transformation. These are not steps toward healing, they are architectural directives. They are the difference between a blade and driftwood. Execute them in sequence, without audience, without performance, without the need for anyone to witness the forge. First, read the rubble before you move a single stone, before you build anything, a new routine. A new identity, a new structure of any kind you will spend deliberate, silent time inside the wreckage. Not to grieve it, to read it. You will identify with cold precision the three primary fracture points, where you placed your sense of self inside something external, where you compromised so gradually you stopped registering the cost, and where you built walls instead of foundations and called the walls strength. The Stoic does not flinch at this inventory. He conducts it the way a surgeon reads a scan, not with emotion, but with the understanding that what is not identified cannot be corrected. Write it down, not for an audience. In private, in the dark, the way Marcus Aurelius wrote, because the forge is not a place for witnesses. The man who completes this step does not rebuild the same architecture. He builds something that has never existed before, because it is built from the only material that was ever real, the honest assessment of what collapsed and why. The asymmetric outcome is this: one honest hour of reading the Rubble saves you a decade of repeating it. Second, enforce the silence. You will not narrate your reconstruction in real time. Not to friends, not to the feed, not to anyone who did not earn the right to stand inside the forge with you. This is not suppression, this is concentration. Every disclosure you make before the work is complete is gold poured into the open air instead of into the fracture. The sovereign who speaks too early about what he is becoming is a man who is building his identity from the reactions he receives rather than from the core he is forging. Silence is not absence. It is pressure, the same pressure that turns carbon into something that can cut glass. The modern impulse to process publicly is the impulse of a man who needs the mirror of other people's approval to know he exists. The disciplined man does not need that mirror. He is building the core that makes the mirror irrelevant. The asymmetric outcome is this: the man who forges in silence emerges as something the audience cannot categorize, because he was not built for their consumption. Third, place weight on the new architecture before you trust it. A blade is not finished when it leaves the fire. It is tested deliberately against resistance. The warrior does not wait for life to apply the weight, he applies it himself. Incrementally, with intention, before the stakes are catastrophic. This means voluntarily entering the conditions that previously caused collapse, not recklessly, but with the cold awareness of a man who is stress-testing his own structure. It means placing real commitments on the new architecture before you are certain it will hold. It means choosing the hard conversation, the exposed position, the moment of genuine risk, not because you are certain of the outcome, but because the only way to know if the gold has filled the fracture is to apply force to it. Comfort is not a stage of the forge, it is the end of it. The man who builds and never tests has not built a blade. He has built a monument, static, decorative, useless under real weight. The asymmetric outcome is this: the architecture that has been deliberately tested before the crisis is the only architecture that holds during it. You are not a finished structure. You are not the collapse, and you are not the performance of recovery that followed it. You are unfinished marble, not broken, not incomplete, but in process. The sculptor does not mourn the stone that is not yet the form. He reads the grain of it. He understands where the marble wants to fracture and where it will hold. He works with the material, not against it, and he does not rush the chisel because the stone is not finished yet. That is what you are: unfinished marble with fracture lines that are not flaws, they are the map. They are the exact blueprint of where the gold goes. The man who reads that map honestly, who forges in silence, who tests the architecture before he trusts it, that man does not reassemble. He becomes something that was not possible before the fire. Not because the fire was kind, because he paid attention to what it showed him. The forge is not a metaphor for a better morning routine. It is not a reframe designed to make the collapse feel meaningful. It is the mechanical reality of what identity actually is, not a fixed thing you possess, but a structure you are always either building with intention or allowing to assemble itself from whatever material is nearest. The weak assemble, the disciplined forge. The difference between those two words is the difference between a life that holds its shape and a life that spends every decade rebuilding the same structure from the same unexamined materials. The fire has already shown you what you are made of. The rubble is still readable. The gold is still available. The silence is still there, waiting to be used as pressure rather than endured as absence. The only question that remains is the same question it has always been, not what happened to you, but what you are choosing to forge in response. Only those who refuse comfort will understand what comes next. Subscribe to Marble in Mind.